Good morning, everyone. It's good to see all of you on this bittersweet morning. Like I've been saying the last couple of calls this week, this is actually our last Path Forward call in our series. And that doesn't mean that we're never doing any calls again, but it simply means that this series is coming to an end as I take a couple weeks to develop a fall workshop series that I am really particularly excited about. And will likely be hybrid events. So there will be a way to join us for those workshops in person, as well as join us through Zoom if you prefer, or it's more convenient for you to have a digital option. So we're really excited to provide that for our members coming up here soon. I see that Paul, you are on the line. Hello.
Hey, Christine, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thank you for asking.
Excellent. It's great to see you. Great to have you. So it's about 1 minute until the top of the hour. So we'll go ahead and just give everyone a couple more moments to hop on the call so we have as many people as possible on board before we get going with our conversation. And until then, in addition to some updates about the workshop series, I just want to thank our partners, in particular Wells Fargo, BBSI, Office Depot, and Bailey, who have taken particular interest in this series and underwritten our ability to be able to bring this series to all of you. So for those of you who have been on many Path Forward calls and who have benefited from them, I'm sure that your thanks join ours to our partners and extend your thanks to them as well. All right, so I think that we're getting close to the top of the hour now. I think before we launch into our questions, Paul, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So hi, everyone. My name is Paul Boger. I've been with KUNR Public Radio for about 3.5 years now. Joined in January 2017, but I've been a reporter for about 10 years now. Previously, I worked in Mississippi covering politics there. So it's been interesting kind of to see the two sides of the coin, if you will, to go from a very conservative state where it's kind of a pre-known factor that it's going to be a very Republican heavy place, and going to this kind of crazy swing state where it's leaning blue and things are changing and there's a transition. So it's been really interesting to cover and follow. Of course, I'm just one person at KUNR. You know, we try to cover all of Eastern California and Northern Nevada, and I think we do a pretty good job. And you know, if you're looking for quality news, I definitely recommend that's the place you check out.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that sentiment. I worked in journalism for 6.5 years up until joining the chamber in March, and the transformation just in that time from in 2014 experiencing a red wave to where we are now.
Absolutely.
It's almost unbelievable the changes that have occurred in even less than a decade.
Right.
But also, I thank you. I thank you for showing your face today. I know that I know your voice from the radio. I listen to you guys every morning on my way into work and on my way home. And I'm sure that there are folks on the call who appreciate your voice in news as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just jump right into these very simple, easy, straightforward questions, shall we? So in order to kick things off, if you could just give us one word or phrase or observation that you feel sums up how these two special sessions of the Nevada legislature went in the last couple of weeks, what would that word or phrase be?
Frustrating. I don't mean that to be be snarky, but it was a frustrating process. I think just about for everyone, right? You have these super incredibly complex issues with the state budget being in this massive budget crisis, $1 billion short, nearly cover like a quarter of the entire state budget gone. And then you've got these major social justice issues and trying to tackle those at the same time as you're looking at down the barrel of an election in a few months. At the same time, you're trying to figure out this massive liability bill. I mean, for lawmakers, I don't think anybody was quite happy with what turned out, and maybe that's a good thing. if everybody's a little bit displeased, maybe it's decent legislation. On the flip side of that, it was also an incredibly frustrating process to cover. It was a closed session, essentially, while the public was able to stream the hearings and the floor sessions, they weren't in the building. And it wasn't just the public at large, it was the lobbyists were in the building. It was really just lawmakers, staff, and journalists. So it was a difficult few weeks to kind of try to parse all of this really heavy legislation when no one's talking to anyone, really, other than the few public press conferences, or the few press conferences that leadership held during the two sessions. We really didn't hear from lawmakers too much, which is a little bit different. Usually they're out and about in the building, wandering around. They were locked up tight in their offices, and they had questions themselves. A lot of them didn't know what was going on behind closed doors. So it was just, it's interesting to kind of juxtapose how the session usually works to what we saw over the last few months, or last few weeks rather.
Right, absolutely. And a quick follow-up to that, kind of speaking to the insular nature of these two sessions, what would you say in terms of volume of participation from the public when it comes to public comment or even testimony in the context of a hearing? How many people would you say participated digitally, because that's what was offered,
right,
folks, versus how many people tend to participate in a normal session, whether special or otherwise, in person?
That's a hard question to answer, but looking at the type of legislation, these larger bills that are more controversial, those tend to receive lots of public attention, even in regular sessions. So there's always going to be that heavy public comment period. But what we saw was during this session is that it was very divided, right? It was, first off, public comment was limited based on which chamber. It was an hour for each side in the Assembly and 30 minutes each side in the Senate. Which really cuts down on what we've seen in the past. I've seen public comment for some bills in regular session last 8 hours. I specifically the background check bill from 2019 session.
Right.
But that was a long, long day. The new Nevada plan, which was passed in the 2019 session, that was another incredibly long public comments period. So I don't want to say that there was more public comment or less public comment. It was just different, right? We're living in this incredibly turbulent time where I think everybody's just kind of making up the rules as we go along. And so it was difficult to ascertain, exactly where we were at with some of these bills, because the voices that we were hearing were also the same voices that were calling on every single bill. So it's, that public comment focus there and getting input from the public and at large for lawmakers, it really didn't seem to translate in a lot of ways. And for some bills, though, it really did. And the liability bill in particular is one of those bills where we saw a public outcry and then changes to the bill happening in real time. So.
Gotcha. And it's interesting in this era of COVID where we're connecting digitally more than we ever have before. The concept, what comes to my mind frequently, and especially in the context of public comment and testimony, is the concept of distance bias, that if you have people who are in a room and you have one voice that is not in the room, that is coming through other means, whether through a phone, whether through a Zoom call, there's always a measure of distance and almost inability or less inability to hear or absorb what that voice is saying. So that's something that comes to my mind frequently when I think about that process.
And you know what? I'll go ahead and say it. It's now that you mention it, that was true. Normally during hearings on bills, people are giving public comment to lawmakers' faces. Mm-hmm. That wasn't the case. As a matter of fact, what the public saw was just a red screen that said public comment, right? Or public hearing, something like that. But if you walked into the chamber, What you saw was lawmakers milling about. Most of them were sitting, listening, but some were on their phones, some were talking. Um, whether they listen or not, it's up to them.
Right.
But you're right. There was some of that disconnect because all of these presentations were done virtually.
Mm-hmm.
No one was in the chamber presenting these hearings or presenting these bills or giving public comment. That was all done digitally.
Right. Which is unprecedented, to be sure.
Right.
And hopefully we don't have to endure too many more months, God forbid years, in which that is the primary means of connecting with lawmakers. Thank you for that quick aside. I appreciate that. So let's jump into the 31st session, which was the first of the two special sessions that we've experienced this year. So of course, the 31st session was primarily focused around the budget. I think what was really interesting about that in particular, and I think maybe you've alluded to this a little bit, to this dynamic, lawmakers seemed, at least, from me as an outsider, to stick to the script in a sense that, the governor's office handed a proposed budget cuts to the legislature. For the most part, those budget cuts seemed to go through without a whole lot of change. Can you tell us a little bit about what you observed when it came to the process of vetting out those budget cuts, of the governor's proposed budget cuts, and what we ended up getting at the end of the day?
So it was kind of a mixed bag, right? It did stick fairly close to what the governor proposed. And the reason for that is a large percentage of those cuts happened on the departmental and divisional level, right? This is what those department heads said, hey, I can give you this much. This is what we can cut. This is what we're good with. And they took that to the governor took it to the lawmakers, and really there wasn't much they could do with that. Whether you like it or not, whether you agree think it's a good thing or a bad thing, Nevada runs a pretty tight ship fiscally. A lot of states similar size, Mississippi being one of them, about a state of 3 million people, has almost double the annual budget Mississippi does, at least on the general fund side. So it's really, there's not a whole lot of room to cut in a state budget like Nevada's. So where you did see those cuts is in those larger line items, those big budgets. Biggest budgets in the state, almost every state, is K-12 education, HHS, Health and Human Services, and then usually NG, right? It's usually or higher learning. That's where we saw kind of the biggest swings in some of that, in some of that funding. And I think the reason we saw those changes, especially when it came to taking more from NG than the governor suggested or the governor proposed, and then trying to put more money back towards Health and Human Services, and then using CARES Act dollars for K-12 funding, that was a way to kind of to parse what we heard during public comment, especially during that first session. Was we heard testimony time and again during those bills that cuts to Medicare and cuts to Medicaid were only going to hurt the state more because the state pulls down those federal dollars, those federal matching dollars. So every dollar cut from Medicaid is really like cutting $2. That's why you saw so much effort from lawmakers to rectify those cuts. On the education side, we didn't see any cuts to the per pupil funding, right? That's the base amount every school gets for each student. Where we saw the cuts were in those categorical funding elements. So the read by 3, the some transportation costs, some teacher classroom reduction size funds. Those are where we saw the cuts because that's where lawmakers could justify that, and they did try to rectify, like I said, with the CARES Act money, but it was just kind of it's a Band-Aid, right? So. Right,
absolutely. So jumping to the 32nd session, which just concluded last week. And you already alluded to this. One of the big concerns was that liability shield, those liability shield protections. Of course, one of the huge headlines from the passage of that measure is the fact that it wasn't who got included, it was who got excluded. So hospitals and schools being excluded. What can you tell us about how this legislation came to pass and why those particular industries were excluded?
I cannot tell you how this legislation came to pass, right? I do not have I do not have that pay grade, and it is a big mystery. It is, as a matter of fact, during a presentation on the bill, during the initial presentation on the bill, somebody from the governor's staff let it slip that, oh, the bill that they were seeing at that point was part of a larger deal. He didn't elaborate into that, but he did say that. So this is a deal between the state, the Culinary Union, and the Resort Association, and essentially gaming at large, right? Because that is the state's largest economic driver. That is the industry to be here. So that's why this bill in particular pays so much attention to tourism and hospitality in general. Even into the code language, it refers to guests and hotel rooms, like to a point like this is laying out exactly what resorts have to do.
Right.
For all other businesses, which are covered under this liability bill. So the general blanket is, as long as a business is substantively following the local health guidelines set out by the health district, that their local health district, they'll be in compliance. As long as they're trying to show good faith and work towards that, they're covered. Now, what the legal, I'm not a lawyer, so I cannot speak to what that legally means, but the bill also has some workplace protections as well, or some workforce protections. The employees are required to have give employees 2 weeks leave if they show symptoms or if they've come into contact with somebody with COVID. So those types of things are also in there. But going back to the schools and hospitals portion of this particular question or this particular bill, those were left out for a few different reasons, all of them political, right? Teachers and teachers' unions have voiced concerns about returning to the classroom. That is what we're seeing play out here in Washoe County right now, with Washoe Education Association filing a complaint with OSHA. We're seeing that with the protests. Lawmakers, teachers' unions made a lot of public comments about schools not being in this because they want school districts and school leadership to think twice about reopening, right? We're less than a week from opening and we've already got 3 or 4 people showing symptoms that would normally be in classrooms. So removing liability for schools is to force that question, hey, do you really want to open up? The hospital's question is completely different. It's still political. We heard from healthcare associations and trial lawyer associations that they don't want that liability in the bill, that liability coverage. And what lawmakers and the governor's office said, the reason they removed hospitals is because that protection is already granted under the governor's 11th emergency directive. So I think that's the April 1st directive, right? That they're already granted that immunity protection, and so they don't have to be covered in this bill. Both of these are set to expire. The governor's directive and the liability bill are supposed to expire when the emergency declarations end. But when that's going to be, we don't know. So there's also an end date of 2023 in the liability bill.
That's fascinating. And as you said, the ramifications are playing out right before our eyes. And what day is it? Thursday? 4 more days until Washington schools go back into session. Whew, you're going to be busy. You and your team are going to be busy. Let's just leave it at that.
and don't forget, there's an election going on.
Right.
Like, we're going to have to vote at some point. So that's also something to keep us busy with.
Right. Absolutely. Another big question in the second of the 2 special sessions we've experienced just in the last 2 months was about mining tax reform. Now, what was really interesting was that we had three, correct me if I'm wrong, three different measures. What was really interesting about the three measures is that there were some striking similarities between the three in the language, in the approach, but some differences, of course. Can you perhaps explain, well, one, what the overarching strategy is for mining tax reform? I know that it's something that's been talked about for decades, arguably. So what's the overall thinking behind mining tax reform? But also, what is the strategy in passing three separate measures that the legislature will have to reconsider again coming in February?
So there were four measures that were brought up in total during the two special sessions. I'll just talk about all of them real quick. The first one was a bill that would have capped the amount of deductions a mining operation can take out on their taxes, their state taxes. So they have this, under the Constitution, they have this 5% cap on net proceeds of mining. That was written into the Constitution in 1864 and has remained there ever since and has not been touched, right? So it is arguable that Nevada has this really archaic taxing structure for mining. So a lot of folks, especially progressives, activists, they see mining as this potential source of revenue that could help bolster the state, especially in a time of crisis. Well, it depends on who you ask, right? If you ask folks in Washoe County or in Clark County if that's true, they'll probably say yes. Whereas if you go out to the rurals, if you go out to Elko, they're going to say, like, these companies are the lifeblood of these communities. Without them, they don't have these people living there. So that's kind of where we're at with the mining question. So you had this first bill that would have capped deductions. That was killed during the first session by the Republicans after a couple crazy days of debate. During the second special session, we had three proposed constitutional amendments. That's what came out. So those are technically resolutions. Under Nevada's constitutional process, you have to, for lawmakers to amend the Constitution, they have to make a proposed amendment, and then they have to vote on it again the next session, and then it gets sent to the ballot during the next election. What lawmakers did during the 32nd special session was they cut that process in half, right? Because normally it's 2 years between each legislative session. So by passing these resolutions now, they're able to bring them back up again during the 2021 session, and that way they'll be on the ballot in 2022 if they agree on one of these proposals. So the different proposals, the different resolutions that came out of the second session were essentially, two of them were basically the same. Changing net proceeds to gross proceeds, right? This kind of blanket upping of how much money the state will get. Quite a bit, as a matter of fact, almost 2 or 3 times more money if they change the wording, just the one word. Excuse me. Now, the two proposals differed in how they would use the money. One of them said, the state would get half, and then they would send half to voters or to residents, almost like Alaska's oil dividends, right? Kind of a similar process there. That one, I think, was probably the most derided of the set. The other one dealt with, putting half the money towards education or health and human services, and the other half going to the general fund. So 2 basic ideas there. The third was this compromise piece of legislation that would change the amount to 12% of the net proceeds instead of gross proceeds. And therefore, they would split the money, and there were all these triggers. That one would collect less money, but it was probably the most, it was the consensus builder one. That's the one you can tell that they're really going to push in 2021. So I think there's this argument, though, that mining has to kind of come back, join the 21st century. And for a lot of progressives, especially, they don't see mining as paying their fair share. So that's going to be a massive topic, I think, during the 2021 regular session.
Right, absolutely. And to your point, an expedited conversation as well, which That is absolutely fascinating. It's interesting to think that we could be seeing this on our ballots as soon as 2022. So we got to get ourselves ready, stay informed. So just a quick note to everybody on the call, since we're starting to close in on the end. Just a reminder, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, please go ahead and put those in Zoom chat as soon as possible so that I can see them and we can potentially address as many of those as we can before we run out of time. So thank you very much for doing that. So really quickly, or at least as quickly as possible, police reform. We saw AB3 pass the legislature in this last session. What are you hearing from the local law enforcement? Local meaning, in our jurisdiction, Reno, Sparks Police, Washoe County Sheriff's Office. What have you heard from those entities when it comes to their reaction to this police reform?
To be completely honest with you, I did not necessarily cover police reform as in-depthly this session. I actually had my colleague, Lucia Starbuck, cover that more. But I'll tell you what I've seen and what I've heard. Essentially AB3, bans chokeholds, does some police reform. But a lot of this police reform that was kind of put down put in the statute was a lot of what we've seen police departments around the country already doing, a lot of the states.
Sure.
But this wasn't a drastic step forward. This wasn't some, progressive monolith of a bill. This was kind of common sense reform in a lot of ways. And I think you're hearing that from the police departments that are working to actually put this stuff into practice. You see that there's a willingness from the Reno Police Department, from UNR's police department. The chief of UNR police came out pretty strongly for it. You're seeing them take these steps already. Not everybody, of course, is thrilled. Las Vegas police union at one point said it was voiced opposition to this, saying more needs to be done to address resisting arrest, and they have at one point saying compliance saves lives. So there's definitely a resistance to this, especially when it comes into play with the language that was changed, moving all means necessary and going towards reasonable force, right? That's kind of where some folks see a difference. But I think a lot of folks, especially in Northern Nevada, see this as the path forward.
Right, certainly, and it does seem as though this measure served to codify the changes that were already taking place within our jurisdictions, within our law enforcement communities. So you're right, not necessarily landmark legislation in that regard, but at least it's on the books, and
exactly.
that's good to see. So what would you say these past two special sessions failed to address that needed to be addressed? And if you were to choose priorities or to predict priorities for subsequent special sessions, if we're going to have any, what do you think those would be?
Well, I'll tell you, I don't know if there's going to be another special session at this point. I don't think there's a lot of goodwill in the building right now between the two chambers. I don't think there's a lot of goodwill between the legislature and the governor's office. I think this was a difficult process for everybody. And of course, I could be reading into it and everybody's going to say it's fine and chummy and everybody's getting along. But it just did not have that feeling, right? Everything was tense. No one was talking. No one was getting along. So I just don't think there's going to be another special session. What I think lawmakers may have failed to address is, I think, while there were some workplace protections for employees in the liability bill, I think that's going to be a larger issue as we continue down this path of dealing with the pandemic. And honestly, I think there's going to be a time very soon when the state is going to have to deal with its tax structure, right? Nevada does not collect enough money in tax revenue to provide the services that the current administration and legislative body want to give, or the voters seem to want. So I think during the next session specifically, there is going to be this larger conversation of what does a fair and equitable tax structure in Nevada look like? Mm-hmm. There's probably going to be some look at property taxes. I think that's where we're definitely going to see some movement. And I think there's going to be, of course, the mining taxes. I've heard some people say that there's going to be an attempt for an income tax. That's not going to happen in Nevada. There is a constitutional amendment against it. It is not allowed. That being said, we've seen them initiate the process to change taxes. So, hey, somebody may bring it up, somebody may talk about it. I just do not see there being any desire for an income tax.
Right. It almost is akin to Nevada's identity.
Right.
We've staked our identity in the fact that we will not have a state income tax. So it would be a huge unprecedented shift to see something like that happen, and to see an appetite for it, for sure. But and I think we can certainly all agree that we do not envy our lawmakers for what they need to do right now. But
no.
And perhaps you would agree with this. I would say, pandemic notwithstanding, I have seen our legislature cooperate. I have seen
absolutely.
our legislature work wonders and get so much accomplished together, and be such a great example of reaching across the aisle, as worn out of a phrase as that is. They've exemplified it. And so,
absolutely.
Fingers crossed that February 2021 will see a return to normalcy, not only in regard to the pandemic, fingers crossed, vaccine, but also return to normalcy when it comes to cooperation in those chambers and beyond. So thank you so much, Paul, for your insight. I'm not seeing any additional questions, which means that you did a great job.
Hey, all right.
Anticipating all of the questions that people may have. Also, drinking from a fire hose is also an effect that these calls tend to have on folks, myself included. But we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I just want to say thank you once again for lending your expertise to us for the last half hour, and also for lending your service to our community and to our democracy. So keep up the good work and fight the good fight. And thank you again. Thanks for everyone for being on this call. It's been a pleasure to moderate this Path Forward series, and I'm really excited for what we've got on tap in the future.
If I can just have a final,
of course,
summation. The one takeaway I think of the special session is that lawmakers are working. Working without a net, right?
Right.
There is absolutely no playbook for this.
Mm-hmm.
So especially when it comes to the budget cuts, the COVID-related budget cuts we've seen in the 31st session were essentially 2 to 3 times what we saw in the last recession. So it's absolutely, it's vital that we don't look at it, try to compare one economic fallout to another, because this is very much different from anything we've dealt with before. So going forward, I also recommend, tuning into KUNR for that legislative update. And I just want to say KUNR is part of the Northern Nevada News Alliance, which is a group of local media spreading awareness about the challenges facing the industry. It's an alliance that is actually holding another virtual event on how to spot fake news on August 27th. That's at 4 p.m. and you can find that at nevadanewsalliance.com. Just wanted to make sure I got that plug in there so I can make all the editors happy.
Yes, absolutely.
And when we're talking about the election coming up, I definitely wanted to make sure, people are conscientious of where they're getting their news and where they're thinking about showing people on how to vote or talking to people on voting. Make sure that they're just conscious of where they're getting the news and make sure they're spreading the right narrative.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that reminder. And I can personally vouch for the Nevada News Alliance sessions. I attended the last one. It was fantastic. So I have no doubt that this next session will be fantastic as well. And I hope that all of our members, especially since the Path Forward series is coming to an end, that you will find some other digital sources of inspiration and information. So Nevada News Alliance, I know that you guys are active on social, so our members are free to check you guys out on social. And with that, I thank you again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.